Olmec. When you hear this word today, you might think of those massive stone heads with their distinctive features that have become iconic symbols of ancient Mexico, displayed in museums and textbooks around the world. Perhaps you imagine mysterious jungle ruins, or you recall vague references to them as the mother culture of Mesoamerica. For many people, the Olmecs remain shrouded in mystery, an enigmatic civilization that emerged seemingly from nowhere in the tropical lowlands of Mexico's Gulf Coast. They are often overshadowed by the more famous Maya and Aztec civilizations that came after them, relegated to a brief mention in history books, before moving on to supposedly more important cultures. Yet this perception could not be more misleading. The Olmecs were not merely another ancient people. They were the first major civilization of Mesoamerica, the culture that established many of the fundamental patterns that would define thousands of years of subsequent development in ancient Mexico and Central America. They created monumental architecture, developed sophisticated artistic traditions, established complex trade networks spanning hundreds of miles, and laid the groundwork for religious and political systems that would endure long after their cities fell silent. So, who were the Olmecs, and how did this remarkable civilization emerge to transform the ancient Americas? The very name Olmec presents our first challenge in understanding this ancient people. Unlike the Maya, who left extensive written records, or the Aztecs, whose history was documented by Spanish conquistadors, the Olmecs left no texts that we can definitively read, no accounts of their own history or mythology that have survived in comprehensible form. The name Olmec itself is not what they called themselves, but rather a term borrowed from much later Aztec sources, referring to people who lived in the rubber-producing regions along the Gulf Coast. In the Nahuatl language spoken by the Aztecs, Olmec means literally rubber people, a reference to the latex-producing trees that grew abundantly in the region. When archaeologists in the early 20th century began to recognize the distinctive artistic style and cultural traits of this ancient civilization, they adopted this Aztec term, even though more than 2,000 years separated the Aztecs from the people they were naming. What the Olmecs actually called themselves remains one of the many mysteries surrounding this foundational culture. Our knowledge of the Olmecs comes almost entirely from archaeology, from the patient excavation and analysis of their cities, monuments, artifacts, and settlements scattered across the tropical lowlands of southern Veracruz and Tabasco in modern Mexico. The story of how the Olmecs were discovered and recognized as a distinct civilization is itself a fascinating chapter in the history of archaeology. For centuries, the massive stone heads and other Olmec monuments were known to local inhabitants, but they were not recognized as belonging to a distinct ancient culture. Spanish colonial sources occasionally mentioned large stone sculptures in the region, but these references were fragmentary and attracted little systematic attention. It was not until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that scholars began to take serious notice of these monuments and to recognize that they represented something unique in the archaeological record of ancient Mexico. The breakthrough in Olmec studies came in the 1920s and 30s, when archaeologists began to systematically investigate the major Olmec sites and to recognize the distinctive artistic style that characterized their monuments and portable artifacts. Matthew Sterling, working with the Smithsonian Institution, conducted crucial excavations at major Olmec centers, including San Lorenzo and Venta, uncovering massive stone heads, altars, and other monuments that clearly belonged to a sophisticated civilization. However, there was considerable debate about when this civilization had flourished. Some scholars initially believed that Olmec culture was contemporary with, or even later than, the classic Maya civilization, which reached its peak between roughly 200 and 900 in the Common Era. It was the Mexican archaeologist and scholar Alfonso Caso who, in a landmark conference in 1942, argued convincingly that Olmec culture was much earlier than previously thought, and that it represented the mother culture of Mesoamerica, the civilization from which later cultures had drawn many of their fundamental characteristics. Casso's thesis sparked decades of debate among scholars, with some questioning whether it was appropriate to designate any single culture as the mother of all subsequent Mesoamerican civilizations. This debate was not merely academic, but touched on fundamental questions about how civilizations develop, whether through independent invention or cultural diffusion, and how we should understand the relationships between different ancient societies. Over time, as radiocarbon dating and other scientific methods allowed for more precise chronologies, it became clear that Olmec civilization did indeed predate the classic Maya and other later Mesoamerican cultures. While scholars today might debate the extent of Olmec influence and prefer terms like sister culture rather than mother culture, there is broad consensus that the Olmecs were the first civilization in Mesoamerica to develop the complex of traits that would characterize later societies: monumental architecture, sophisticated art styles, long-distance trade networks, social stratification, and complex religious systems centered on shared cosmological concepts. The environmental context in which Olmec civilization emerged was crucial to understanding both its development and its distinctive characteristics. The Olmec heartland, located in the modern Mexican states of Veracruz and Tabasco along the Gulf Coast, is a region of tropical lowlands characterized by rivers, wetlands, and fertile alluvial plains. This is not the dry highland environment where some other early civilizations developed, but rather a humid, rainfall-rich zone where dense vegetation flourished and where water management was both a challenge and an opportunity. The region's rivers, particularly the Coatzacoalcos and Tonala river systems, provided transportation routes, sources of fish and other aquatic resources, and fertile soils deposited by seasonal flooding. The tropical forests yielded valuable resources including hardwoods, medicinal plants, and the latex-producing rubber trees that would later give the region its Aztec name. This environment, while rich in resources, also presented significant challenges for the development of complex society. The high rainfall and humidity made preservation of organic materials difficult, which is one reason why we have so little surviving evidence of Olmec textiles, woodwork, or written records, if they existed. The tropical climate also meant dealing with diseases, insects, and the rapid growth of vegetation that could quickly reclaim cleared areas. Yet the Olmec people not only adapted to this environment, but thrived in it, developing agricultural systems that could support dense populations and monumental construction projects that required the coordination of substantial labor forces. The key to their success lay in their ability to exploit the diverse resources of their environment, from the rich soils of the river valleys to the stone resources of the distant highlands, which they accessed through extensive trade networks. The origins of Olmec civilization remain somewhat obscure, as is often the case with ancient cultures that emerged before the development of writing systems we can read. Archaeological evidence suggests that the region was inhabited by farming communities for many centuries before the emergence of what we recognize as Olmec civilization. During the early formative period, roughly from 2000 to 1200 before the Common Era, villages in the region grew larger and more complex, with evidence of increasing social differentiation and craft specialization. These early communities cultivated maize, beans, squash, and other crops, supplementing their diet with fish, shellfish, deer, and other wild resources. They made pottery, wove textiles, and created small-scale art objects. But they had not yet developed the monumental architecture, large-scale sculpture, or complex iconography that would characterize later Olmec civilization. The transformation from these village societies to what we recognize as Olmec civilization occurred during what archaeologists call the initial Olmec period, or early Olmec phase, beginning around 1500 before the Common Era. This transformation was not sudden, but rather a gradual process of increasing complexity, though the pace of change seems to have accelerated dramatically around 1300 before the Common Era. The site of San Lorenzo, located on a plateau overlooking the Coatzacoalcos River basin, emerged as the first great Olmec center during this period. San Lorenzo would dominate the Olmec world for several centuries, serving as the primary center of political power, religious authority, and artistic production during the formative phase of Olmec civilization. San Lorenzo represents one of the most impressive achievements of early Olmec society and demonstrates the organizational capacity and artistic sophistication that characterized this civilization at its emergence. The site was not simply a natural plateau, but was extensively modified through massive earth-moving projects that reshaped the landscape to create a suitable setting for monumental architecture and ceremonial spaces. The plateau was artificially leveled and expanded, with an estimated 800,000 cubic meters of earth moved to create the platform on which the city was built. This alone represents an extraordinary investment of labor, requiring the coordination of thousands of workers over extended periods. The motivations for such massive landscape modification were likely both practical and symbolic. The elevated platform provided protection from seasonal flooding while also creating a visually impressive setting that expressed the power and authority of the rulers who commanded such resources. On this artificially modified landscape, the Olmecs of San Lorenzo constructed a complex of buildings, plazas, and monuments that served as the ceremonial and administrative heart of their civilization. While much of the architectural detail has been lost to time and the tropical climate, archaeological excavations have revealed the foundations of substantial structures arranged around open plazas, creating spaces for public gatherings, rituals, and ceremonies. These architectural arrangements would establish patterns that would be repeated and elaborated in later Mesoamerican cities for thousands of years. The combination of pyramidal platforms, open plazas, and carefully aligned buildings that created ceremonial landscapes designed to impress and to channel the movement of people during important rituals and events. But it is the monumental sculpture of San Lorenzo that most dramatically demonstrates the capabilities and artistic vision of early Olmec civilization. The site has yielded 10 massive stone heads, those iconic sculptures that have become synonymous with Olmec culture in the popular imagination. Each of these colossal heads was carved from a single block of basalt, weighing between 6 and 50 tons, and depicting what appear to be individual rulers or important personages wearing elaborate headdresses. The faces are rendered with remarkable naturalism and individuality, suggesting that these were portraits of actual people rather than generic representations. The skill required to carve these massive sculptures is impressive enough, but what makes them even more remarkable is that the basalt from which they were carved had to be transported from the Tuxtla Mountains, located some 50 miles away from San Lorenzo. The logistics of quarrying, transporting, and carving these colossal heads reveal much about Olmec society and its organizational capabilities. The basalt boulders had to be quarried from the mountains, shaped into rough forms, and then transported across difficult terrain that included rivers, wetlands, and forests. Without wheeled vehicles or draft animals, which were not available in ancient Mesoamerica, this transportation would have required hundreds of workers using wooden rollers, ropes, and rafts to move each massive stone. The journey from quarry to San Lorenzo would have taken weeks or months and required careful planning, substantial resources to feed and house the workers, and sophisticated engineering knowledge to navigate the challenges of the landscape. Once at San Lorenzo, skilled sculptors would have spent months carefully carving each head, using stone tools to shape the hard basalt into the detailed portraits we see today. The colossal heads were not the only monumental sculptures at San Lorenzo. The site has also yielded numerous other carved stone monuments, including altars, stelae, and sculptures depicting humans, animals, and supernatural beings. Many of these monuments show evidence of having been deliberately defaced or buried at some point in antiquity, perhaps during episodes of political upheaval or ritual termination of the monument's power. This practice of ritually destroying or burying monuments would become a common pattern in Mesoamerican civilizations, reflecting beliefs about the sacred power of these objects and the need to properly decommission them when their active use ended. Some monuments were carved with scenes depicting rulers seated in niches or caves, establishing visual connections between political authority and sacred geography that would remain important themes in Mesoamerican art for centuries to come. Beyond the monumental stone sculptures, San Lorenzo has yielded rich evidence of Olmec material culture and daily life. Excavations have uncovered elaborate drainage systems constructed from carefully fitted basalt columns, demonstrating sophisticated hydraulic engineering. These drains may have served practical purposes in managing water flow across the site, but they may also have had ritual significance, as water and its control were deeply symbolic in Mesoamerican religious thought. The site has also yielded evidence of craft production, including the manufacture of pottery, stone tools, and objects made from imported materials such as obsidian, jade, and magnetite. The presence of these imported materials, some from sources hundreds of miles away, demonstrates that San Lorenzo was at the center of extensive trade networks that connected the Olmec heartland to distant regions. The society that built and maintained San Lorenzo was clearly hierarchical and stratified, with a ruling elite that commanded the labor and resources necessary for monumental construction projects and long-distance trade. The colossal heads, likely representing individual rulers, suggest that political power was personalized and, perhaps, hereditary, with individual leaders claiming authority that justified their commemoration in permanent stone monuments. The concentration of elaborate artifacts and architectural features in certain areas of the site suggests residential differentiation, with elite families occupying more substantial dwellings and having access to luxury goods denied to commoners. Yet the details of Olmec political organization remain frustratingly unclear due to the absence of readable written records. We cannot say with certainty whether San Lorenzo was the capital of a unified Olmec state, the center of a loose confederation of allied communities, or simply the most powerful among several competing centers. What is clear is that San Lorenzo's dominance was not eternal. Around 900 before the Common Era, the site experienced a dramatic transformation. Many of the monuments were systematically defaced, broken, or buried. The colossal heads were toppled and interred in carefully prepared pits. Other sculptures were mutilated, with faces chipped away and bodies broken. The site was not completely abandoned, but it clearly lost its position as the primary center of Olmec civilization. The reasons for this transformation remain debated among scholars. Some have suggested internal revolt, with subject populations rising against their rulers and destroying the symbols of elite power. Others have proposed conquest by external enemies, though there is little evidence of widespread burning or destruction that might accompany military defeat. Still, others suggest that the changes reflect ritual termination of the monuments rather than violent destruction, perhaps associated with the death of important rulers or changes in religious practices. Whatever the reasons for San Lorenzo's decline, political and ceremonial power in the Olmec world shifted to a new center, Venta. Located on an island in a coastal swamp near the modern border between Veracruz and Tabasco, Venta would dominate Olmec civilization during what archaeologists call the Middle Formative Period, from roughly 900 to 400 before the Common Era. If San Lorenzo represented the birth of Olmec civilization, Venta represented its full florescence, the period when Olmec culture reached its greatest elaboration and when Olmec influence spread most widely across Mesoamerica. Venta was not simply a successor to San Lorenzo, but represented new directions in Olmec architecture, art, and religious expression, innovations that would profoundly influence later Mesoamerican civilizations. The most striking feature of Venta was its Great Pyramid, a massive earthen mound that rose over 100 feet above the surrounding landscape and dominated the site's ceremonial core. This pyramid was not a natural hill, but an entirely artificial construction built from an estimated 100,000 cubic meters of earth and clay, carefully shaped into a distinctive fluted or ridged form. The pyramid's unusual shape has been the subject of much speculation, with some scholars suggesting it was meant to represent a volcano, an interpretation that gained some support from the importance of volcanic symbolism in later Mesoamerican thought. Others have proposed that the ridges represent the petals of a flower or the rays of the sun. Whatever its specific symbolic meaning, the pyramid at Venta established a pattern that would be repeated throughout Mesoamerican history: the construction of massive pyramidal platforms that served as artificial mountains connecting the earthly realm to the heavens and providing stages for rituals that maintained cosmic order. The pyramid anchored a carefully planned ceremonial complex that stretched along a north-south axis for over half a mile. This axial planning, with buildings and monuments arranged along a central line oriented to the cardinal directions, would become a fundamental principle of Mesoamerican urban design, repeated in cities built by the Maya, Zapotecs, Teotihuacanos, and other later cultures. At Venta, the axis was marked by a series of plazas, platforms, and buried offerings, creating a ritual landscape that guided movement and structured ceremonial activities. The precision of this planning, with the axis oriented 8 degrees west of true north, suggests sophisticated astronomical knowledge and the importance of cosmic alignments in Olmec religious thought. Along this ceremonial axis, the Olmecs of Venta placed numerous stone monuments, including 4 colossal heads, similar to those at San Lorenzo, but carved in the distinctive Venta style. They also created altars or thrones carved with elaborate scenes of rulers and supernatural beings, stelae depicting human figures, and sculptures of animals, including jaguars, which held special importance in Olmec iconography. But perhaps the most remarkable monuments at Venta were the massive offerings buried beneath the plazas and platforms, elaborate deposits of precious materials that were never meant to be seen again once they were interred. These buried offerings included massive mosaic pavements made from hundreds of carefully cut and fitted blocks of serpentine arranged to form abstract designs, including what appear to be stylized jaguar faces. After these mosaics were completed, they were covered with layers of colored clays and then buried beneath tons of earth, hidden from human eyes, but presumably visible to the gods or supernatural forces to whom they were dedicated. Other buried offerings at Venta included caches of jade and serpentine celts, polished stone axes that were valuable trade goods and ritual objects throughout Mesoamerica. These celts were often arranged in elaborate patterns and accompanied by figurines carved from jade, serpentine, and other greenstone materials. One particularly striking offering, known as Offering 4, consisted of 16 figurines and 6 celts, arranged in a scene that appears to depict a ritual or ceremony. The figurines, carved from various types of greenstone, stand in a group facing a single figure backed by the upright celts, as if witnessing some important event. The meaning of this scene remains mysterious, but it clearly represents a significant investment of valuable materials and skilled craftsmanship, all buried where no living person would see it again. Such offerings reveal the importance of sacrifice and dedication in Olmec religion, the willingness to permanently remove valuable objects from circulation as gifts to supernatural powers. The artistic achievements of Venta extended beyond monumental sculpture and buried offerings to include smaller-scale works of remarkable sophistication. Olmec lapidaries, skilled craftspeople who worked stone, created exquisite objects from jade, serpentine, and other greenstone materials that were highly valued throughout Mesoamerica. These objects included figurines, masks, pendants, beads, and elaborate ornaments that showcased both technical mastery and artistic vision. Working with stone tools, Olmec craftspeople could carve jade, one of the hardest materials available to them, into delicate forms with smooth, polished surfaces and intricate details. The techniques they developed for drilling, sawing, and polishing hard stone would be passed down through generations and adopted by later Mesoamerican cultures. Olmec art, whether monumental or miniature, was characterized by a distinctive style that is immediately recognizable even to non-specialists. The style featured a particular way of representing the human form, with large heads, down-turned mouths, and almond-shaped eyes that give Olmec figures their characteristic appearance. But Olmec artists were not simply following a rigid formula, they created works of great variety and expressiveness, from the individualized portraits of the colossal heads to the dynamic poses of carved figurines. A particularly important theme in Olmec art was the representation of supernatural beings that combined human and animal features, especially those incorporating elements of the jaguar. These were-jaguar figures, as they are sometimes called, appear throughout Olmec art in various forms, from naturalistic jaguar sculptures to human figures with feline features, to fantastical creatures that blend multiple animal and human characteristics. The prominence of jaguar imagery in Olmec art reflects the importance of this powerful predator in Olmec religious thought and cosmology. The jaguar was the largest and most dangerous predator in the Mesoamerican environment, a nocturnal hunter associated with the forest, caves, and the underworld. In Olmec belief systems, the jaguar seems to have been connected with rulership, shamanic transformation, and supernatural power. Rulers may have claimed descent from or special relationships with jaguar spirits, and shamans may have practiced rituals of transformation into jaguar form. The were-jaguar motif, depicting beings that are part human and part jaguar, may represent these concepts of transformation and the connection between human rulers and supernatural powers. This association between jaguars and political religious authority would persist throughout Mesoamerican history, appearing in Maya, Zapotec, and other later cultures. The religious beliefs and practices of the Olmecs, while impossible to fully reconstruct in the absence of written texts, clearly involved complex cosmological concepts and elaborate rituals. The careful planning of ceremonial centers, the creation of monumental art, and the dedication of valuable offerings all point to sophisticated religious systems that required specialized knowledge and the participation of religious specialists. The Olmecs almost certainly had a class of priests or shamans who performed rituals, interpreted cosmic signs, and mediated between the human and supernatural realms. These religious specialists would have possessed knowledge of calendars, astronomy, mythology, and ritual procedures that justified their special status in society. Evidence from Olmec sites suggests the practice of various rituals, including bloodletting, a practice that would become central to later Mesoamerican religions. Bloodletting involved the ritual piercing or cutting of one's own body to offer blood to supernatural powers, a practice that was both an act of sacrifice and a means of inducing altered states of consciousness. Olmec art depicts figures holding what appear to be bloodletting implements, and some monuments show rulers performing what may be bloodletting rituals. The Olmecs also practiced ritual ball games, playing on specially constructed ball courts using a rubber ball. The Mesoamerican ball game would become one of the most widespread and enduring cultural practices in the region, played by virtually every later civilization with important ritual and cosmological significance. While the exact rules and meanings of the Olmec version of the game remain unclear, its presence at Olmec sites demonstrates the antiquity of this tradition. The influence of Venta and Olmec culture during the Middle Formative period extended far beyond the Gulf Coast heartland. Olmec-style artifacts and iconography appear at sites across Mesoamerica, from the Valley of Mexico to the Pacific coast of Chiapas and Guatemala, from the highlands of Oaxaca to the Maya lowlands. This widespread distribution of Olmec-style materials has generated considerable debate among archaeologists about the nature and extent of Olmec influence. Were the Olmecs building an empire, conquering and controlling distant regions? Were they establishing trade colonies or outposts in resource-rich areas? Or were local elites in various regions adopting Olmec styles and iconography as a way of legitimizing their own authority by connecting themselves to the prestigious culture of the Gulf Coast? The evidence suggests that different mechanisms were at work in different regions and at different times. In some areas, particularly those relatively close to the Olmec heartland, there may have been direct Olmec presence, with traders, colonists, or even military forces establishing Olmec influence. In more distant regions, local peoples seem to have selectively adopted certain Olmec traits while maintaining their own distinct cultural traditions. The site of Chalcatzingo in the highlands of Morelos provides a particularly interesting example of Olmec influence outside the heartland. Located in a dramatically different environment from the tropical lowlands, Chalcatzingo features rock carvings in pure Olmec style, depicting rulers seated in caves and supernatural beings. These carvings suggest that local elites at Chalcatzingo were adopting Olmec iconography and perhaps Olmec religious concepts, possibly through direct contact with Olmec peoples or through the mediation of traders and travelers. In the valley of Oaxaca, the early Zapotec civilization that was developing during the same period shows evidence of contact with the Olmecs, with some Olmec-style pottery and iconographic elements appearing at sites like San Jose Mogote. However, the Zapotecs maintained their own distinct cultural identity and developed their own writing system, architectural styles, and artistic traditions. This suggests a relationship of exchange and mutual influence rather than Olmec domination. Similar patterns appear in other regions, indicating that Olmec influence was not uniform, but varied depending on local circumstances, the nature of contact, and the choices made by local peoples about what aspects of Olmec culture to adopt or reject. The mechanisms of Olmec influence likely included trade, which was crucial to Olmec civilization. The Olmec heartland, while rich in some resources, lacked others that were essential for the production of elite goods and ritual objects. Obsidian, a volcanic glass used for sharp-cutting tools and ritual objects, had to be imported from highland sources in central Mexico or Guatemala. Jade and other greenstone materials, highly valued for their color and symbolic associations, came from sources in the Motagua River Valley of Guatemala and possibly other locations. Magnetite, used for making mirrors and other ritual objects, came from sources in Oaxaca. Iron ore for making mirrors came from distant sources, as did various types of stone used for monuments and tools. To obtain these materials, the Olmecs developed extensive trade networks that connected them to peoples across Mesoamerica. These trade networks were not simply economic institutions, but were embedded in social and political relationships. Long-distance trade in ancient Mesoamerica typically involved not anonymous market exchanges, but rather gift-giving and exchanges between elites, relationships that created alliances and obligations. Olmec traders traveling to distant regions would have carried not only trade goods but also ideas, artistic styles, and religious concepts. They may have married into local elite families, creating kinship ties that facilitated continued exchange. They may have served as cultural ambassadors, impressing local peoples with the sophistication and power of Olmec civilization. Through these various mechanisms, Olmec influence spread across Mesoamerica, helping to create a shared set of cultural traits that would characterize the region for thousands of years. Among the most important Olmec innovations that would influence later Mesoamerican civilizations was the development of calendrical systems and possibly writing. While no clearly readable Olmec texts have survived, there is evidence that the Olmecs were developing systems for recording information. Some Olmec monuments bear what appear to be glyphs or symbols that may represent an early form of writing or at least a system of notation. A carved stone monument known as the Cascajal block, discovered in 1999 near the Olmec site of San Lorenzo, bears 62 signs arranged in rows, some of which repeat in patterns that suggest a written text. If this interpretation is correct, it would represent the earliest known writing in the Americas, predating Maya hieroglyphic writing by several centuries. However, with only a single example and no bilingual texts or other means of decipherment, the Cascajal block remains enigmatic, its message locked away perhaps forever. More certain is the Olmec development of calendrical systems. Later Mesoamerican civilizations used complex interlocking calendars, including a 260-day ritual calendar and a 365-day solar calendar, which meshed together to create a 52-year cycle. The origins of these calendrical systems remain debated, but many scholars believe that the Olmecs developed at least the basic concepts that would be elaborated by later cultures. Some Olmec monuments bear what appear to be dates, though without a fuller understanding of Olmec notation systems, these remain difficult to interpret with certainty. The importance of calendars in Mesoamerican civilizations cannot be overstated. They structured ritual life, determined agricultural activities, and provided a framework for understanding cosmic cycles and historical time. If the Olmecs did indeed develop the foundations of these calendrical systems, it would represent one of their most enduring contributions to Mesoamerican civilization. The Olmecs also established patterns of religious symbolism and cosmological thought that would persist throughout Mesoamerican history. Concepts that appear in Olmec art and architecture, such as the importance of the four cardinal directions, the symbolic significance of caves and mountains, the association of rulers with supernatural powers, and the use of bloodletting and sacrifice in ritual practice would all become fundamental elements of later Mesoamerican religions. The Olmec emphasis on maize as both a practical staple crop and a sacred substance with cosmological significance would be inherited by later cultures, which developed elaborate mythologies about maize and its role in human creation. The Olmec practice of orienting ceremonial centers to astronomical alignments, creating ritual landscapes that connected earthly and cosmic realms, would be repeated and elaborated in countless later cities across Mesoamerica. Yet, despite the achievements and influence of Venta, this great center, too, would eventually decline. Around 400 before the Common Era, Venta was abandoned, its monuments defaced or buried in a pattern similar to what had occurred earlier at San Lorenzo. The Great Pyramid remained, but the ceremonial complex was no longer maintained, and the site ceased to function as a major political and religious center. The reasons for Venta's abandonment remain unclear, though various theories have been proposed. Environmental changes may have played a role, as the site's island location made it vulnerable to flooding and changes in river courses. Political upheaval, whether internal conflict or external pressure from rising powers in other regions, may have undermined the authority of La Venta's rulers. Economic changes, such as shifts in trade routes or the exhaustion of local resources, may have made the site less viable. Or the abandonment may have been a deliberate choice, part of a ritual cycle of renewal that required the periodic founding of new ceremonial centers. With the decline of La Venta, the Olmec civilization entered what archaeologists call the terminal formative or epi-Olmec period, a time of transformation and fragmentation. Olmec culture did not simply disappear, rather, it evolved and diversified as different communities in the Gulf Coast region developed their own local variants of the Olmec tradition. Several smaller centers emerged during this period, including Tres Zapotes, which would continue to be occupied into the early Classic period. At Tres Zapotes, archaeologists have found evidence of continued artistic production in Olmec styles, including carved monuments and sophisticated pottery. Importantly, Tres Zapotes has yielded some of the best evidence for Olmec or epi-Olmec writing systems, including stelae bearing long texts in a script that shows clear relationships to later Mesoamerican writing systems but remains only partially deciphered. The most famous monument from Tres Zapotes is Stela C, which bears what is known as a long count date, a calendrical notation that records a specific day within a cycle of approximately 5,000 years. The date on Stela C corresponds to 31 before the Common Era, making it one of the earliest long count dates known from Mesoamerica. The long count calendar would later be used extensively by the Maya to record historical events and astronomical cycles with great precision. The presence of a long count date at Tres Zapotes suggests that this calendrical system was developed during the late Olmec or epi-Olmec period, another indication of Olmec contributions to the shared cultural heritage of Mesoamerica. However, the fragmented nature of the epi-Olmec period means that we have less clear evidence for this era than for the earlier fluorescence of San Lorenzo and Venta. By the early centuries of the Common Era, what we can identify as distinctively Olmec culture had largely disappeared, absorbed into or replaced by new cultural patterns emerging across Mesoamerica. The Classic period, beginning around 200 or 300 in the Common Era, would see the rise of new civilizations including the Classic Maya, the Zapotecs of Monte Alban, and the great city of Teotihuacan in central Mexico. Each of these civilizations developed its own distinctive characteristics, but all of them built upon foundations laid by the Olmecs. The Maya, who would develop the most sophisticated writing system in ancient America and create spectacular cities in the rainforests of the Petén, inherited from the Olmecs the basic patterns of ceremonial center organization, the importance of monumental sculpture commemorating rulers, and fundamental religious concepts. The Zapotecs, who created one of the earliest writing systems in Mesoamerica and built the magnificent mountaintop city of Monte Alban, had been in contact with the Olmecs during the formative period and incorporated some Olmec elements into their own cultural development. Even Teotihuacan, which would become the largest city in the ancient Americas with a population that may have exceeded 100,000 at its peak, showed the influence of patterns established by the Olmecs. Teotihuacan's carefully planned layout, with its monumental pyramids arranged along a central axis, oriented to cosmic alignments, echoed the planning principles pioneered at Venta. The city's emphasis on monumental public architecture, its development of distinctive artistic styles that spread widely through trade and influence, and its apparent role as a pilgrimage center all reflected patterns that had been established centuries earlier by the Olmecs. While Teotihuacan's culture was distinctly its own, with artistic styles and religious symbolism quite different from those of the Olmecs, the underlying principles of urban organization and the role of ceremonial centers in structuring political and religious authority showed clear continuities with the Olmec tradition. The legacy of the Olmecs extended beyond these specific cultural continuities to encompass broader patterns that would characterize Mesoamerican civilization for thousands of years. The Olmecs established the viability of complex society in the tropical lowlands, demonstrating that this challenging environment could support dense populations and monumental construction. They developed trade networks that integrated diverse regions into a single interaction sphere, creating connections that facilitated the spread of ideas and innovations. They pioneered techniques of monumental sculpture and lapidary work that would be built upon by later cultures. They established religious concepts and ritual practices that would remain central to Mesoamerican spirituality until the Spanish conquest. And they created a template for how power should be expressed through monumental architecture and art, how ceremonial centers should be organized, and how rulers should present themselves as mediators between human and supernatural realms. Yet the Olmecs also left mysteries that continue to puzzle scholars. Without readable texts, we cannot know what they called themselves, what languages they spoke, what myths and legends they told, or how they understood their own history. We cannot read the names of individual rulers or reconstruct the specific events that shaped their political history. We do not fully understand their social organization, their kinship systems, or the precise mechanisms by which their rulers maintained authority. The meaning of much of their iconography remains debated, with scholars proposing various interpretations of the supernatural beings, ritual scenes, and symbolic elements that appear in Olmec art. The extent and nature of Olmec influence beyond the heartland continues to generate scholarly discussion, with ongoing debates about whether we should speak of an Olmec empire, an Olmec interaction sphere, or simply Olmec influence on independent local developments. These mysteries have not prevented scholars from recognizing the fundamental importance of the Olmecs to Mesoamerican history. In the decades since Alfonso Caso first argued for the Olmecs as the mother culture of Mesoamerica, archaeological research has consistently confirmed the priority and influence of Olmec civilization. Excavations at Olmec sites have revealed ever more evidence of their sophistication and achievements. Studies of Olmec trade networks have documented the extent of their contacts across Mesoamerica. Analyses of Olmec iconography have identified themes and symbols that would persist for thousands of years. And comparative studies of Mesoamerican civilizations have demonstrated the many ways in which later cultures built upon Olmec foundations, whether consciously borrowing from Olmec traditions or independently developing similar solutions to common challenges. The rediscovery and recognition of Olmec civilization represents an important chapter in the broader history of archaeology and our understanding of ancient America. For too long, the achievements of indigenous American civilizations were minimized or dismissed by scholars who could not imagine that complex societies could develop independently in the Americas. The recognition that the Olmecs had created sophisticated civilization more than 3,000 years ago without any contact with or influence from Old World civilizations helped establish that cultural complexity and civilization were not unique to any particular region, but rather represented universal human capacities that emerged independently in various parts of the world when conditions were favorable. The Olmecs took their place alongside ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and China as one of the world's pristine civilizations, societies that developed complex culture without borrowing from earlier civilizations because no earlier civilizations existed in their regions. The study of the Olmecs also contributed to broader anthropological understandings of how civilizations emerge and develop. The Olmec case demonstrated that monumental architecture and complex society could develop in tropical lowland environments, challenging earlier assumptions that civilizations required either arid environments, where irrigation agriculture created dependencies that could be exploited by emerging elites, or temperate climates that supposedly favored cultural development. The Olmecs showed that given appropriate resources, organizational capacity, and cultural innovations, complex society could emerge in a wide range of environments. Their development of long-distance trade networks highlighted the importance of exchange and interaction in cultural development, while their artistic achievements demonstrated the universal human capacity for creative expression and symbolic thought. In recent decades, new technologies and methodologies have opened fresh perspectives on Olmec civilization. Remote sensing techniques, including LiDAR, which uses laser scanning to create detailed topographic maps even through dense forest cover, have revealed previously unknown archaeological features at Olmec sites. Geochemical sourcing studies, which analyze the chemical composition of artifacts to determine where their raw materials originated, have provided new insights into Olmec trade networks and the sources of materials like obsidian and jade. Isotopic analyses of human remains have offered information about Olmec diet, migration patterns, and social differentiation. And increasingly sophisticated dating techniques have allowed for more precise chronologies, helping to resolve debates about the timing of Olmec developments and their relationships to events in other regions. These new approaches have confirmed some earlier interpretations while challenging others. They have revealed that Olmec sites were often larger and more complex than previously recognized, with extensive residential areas surrounding the ceremonial cores. They have demonstrated that Olmec trade networks were even more extensive than earlier scholars had realized, with connections reaching to regions as distant as the Valley of Mexico, the Maya lowlands, and highland Guatemala. They have shown that social differentiation in Olmec society was marked not only by access to luxury goods, but also by differences in diet, with elites consuming more meat and having access to a wider variety of foods than commoners. And they have pushed back the dates for some Olmec achievements, suggesting that the emergence of complex society in the Gulf Coast may have been even earlier than previously thought. Yet for all these advances, the Olmecs retain an aura of mystery that continues to captivate both scholars and the general public. The colossal heads, with their enigmatic expressions and elaborate headdresses, remain among the most iconic images of ancient America, symbols of a civilization that achieved greatness and then vanished, leaving behind monuments that would outlast the society that created them. The were-jaguar figures, blending human and animal features in ways that hint at beliefs and practices we can only partially reconstruct, speak to religious concepts that were clearly profound and complex, but remain frustratingly opaque. The buried offerings at Venta, with their massive investments of labor and precious materials dedicated to purposes we cannot fully understand, testify to the power of religious belief and ritual practice in Olmec society. The Olmecs remind us that history is not simply the story of the civilizations that left extensive written records or that happened to be flourishing when European colonizers arrived. For every society whose history we can reconstruct in detail, there are others whose achievements were equally remarkable, but whose stories are harder to tell because they left different kinds of evidence. The Olmecs created the first civilization in Mesoamerica, established patterns that would shape the region's cultural development for thousands of years, and achieved artistic and architectural accomplishments that still impress us today. They did all this without leaving texts we can read, without the technological advantages that later societies would develop, and in an environment that posed significant challenges to human settlement and monumental construction. The story of the Olmecs is ultimately a story about human creativity, adaptability, and the drive to create meaning through culture. It is a story about how societies organize themselves, how they express power and authority, how they understand the cosmos and humanity's place within it, and how they create art and architecture that embodies their values and beliefs. It is a story about the emergence of civilization, that complex of traits including cities, monumental architecture, social stratification, specialized craft production, long-distance trade, and sophisticated religious systems that has characterized human societies in various parts of the world for the past 5,000 years. And it is a story that, despite decades of archaeological research and scholarly analysis, retains elements of mystery that continue to inspire investigation and speculation. The Olmecs were not simply the predecessors of later Mesoamerican civilizations. They were a remarkable culture in their own right, one that responded creatively to the opportunities and challenges of their environment and created something new in human history. They transformed the landscape, moving millions of cubic meters of earth to create platforms and pyramids. They carved massive boulders into portraits and monuments, investing thousands of hours of labor to create images that would endure for millennia. They established trade networks spanning hundreds of miles, creating connections that integrated diverse peoples into a single interaction sphere. They developed religious concepts and ritual practices that would shape Mesoamerican spirituality for thousands of years. They created art of great beauty and sophistication, from monumental sculpture to delicate jade carvings. And they did all this not by imitating or borrowing from other civilizations, but through their own ingenuity and creativity. When we ask who were the Olmecs, we are asking about the people who laid the foundations for 3,000 years of Mesoamerican civilization. We are asking about the artists who created the colossal heads and the were-jaguar sculptures, the engineers who designed the Great Pyramid at Venta and the drainage systems at San Lorenzo, the rulers who commanded the labor of thousands and commissioned monuments to commemorate their reigns, the priests who performed rituals and interpreted cosmic signs, the traders who traveled hundreds of miles to obtain jade and obsidian, and the farmers whose labor fed the cities and supported the specialists who created Olmec culture. We are asking about a civilization that emerged in the tropical lowlands of Mexico's Gulf Coast more than 3,000 years ago, flourished for over a millennium, and then transformed into something else, leaving behind monuments and artifacts that would puzzle and inspire later peoples for thousands of years. The Olmecs were the first, but they were not isolated or unique. They were part of a broader pattern of human cultural development, one that saw the independent emergence of complex societies in various parts of the world during the millennia, following the development of agriculture. Like their counterparts in Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, and the Indus Valley, the Olmecs responded to the opportunities created by agricultural surplus, population growth, and social complexity by developing new forms of political organization, religious expression, and artistic achievement. They created their own distinctive answers to universal human questions about power, meaning, and the proper organization of society. And in doing so, they established patterns that would shape not only their own society, but the societies that would follow them for thousands of years. Thank you for watching this documentary.